We had to stand all day long in the same spot. Our abdomens hurt so much, a bucket was passed around for our bodily needs.
Walter Schwarze was a German postal service worker from Leipzig. When he was 25 years old, he was denounced for criticizing the war. Then, the Gestapo searched his home. They found letters from Heinz, his longtime lover. Schwarze was taken to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin.
The winter of 1940-41 was grimly cold. Our pockets were sewn shut. We didn't have gloves. On our feet, we only had rags and wooden shoes. Above us, the crows from the pine forest smelled the dead. When the smoke from the crematorium started to rise, you just kept thinking, when will it be my turn?
I'm Eric Marcus, and this is Making Gay History, the Nazi era. During the Nazis' reign, 100,000 German men were arrested under the anti-gay law, paragraph 175. More than half were convicted, and most were sent to regular prisons. But between 7,000 and 10,000 gay men, like Walter Schwarze, were sent to concentration camps that were ruthlessly administered by the SS, the Nazis' notorious paramilitary organization. In this episode, life in the concentration camps, and later, a glimpse into the experiences of LGBTQ people in Nazi-occupied countries during the war. The earliest known account by a concentration camp survivor who was persecuted for his homosexuality comes from Leo Classen, a gay German doctor. Classen was in his early 30s when he was imprisoned by the Nazis in Sachsenhausen, the same concentration camp as Walter Schwarze. In the mid-1950s, he chronicled his experiences in Humanitas, a West German homophile magazine.
Ours was a barracks like the others, only this one was isolated, surrounded by a high wooden fence. Above the entrance to the barracks, a colorful sign was put up to complete the measure of mockery. On it was written, "Welcome."
Classen then describes the lethal conditions of the brick factory where homosexuals were forced to work in the clay pit, or, as it was known among prisoners, the death pit.
The suffering that now began for us was immeasurable and unimaginable. I cannot recall any other instance of human savagery in the history of mankind that has left such terrible traces of blood and tears as this. Clinker, the brick factory. Within 2 months of this work detail, our penal company had shrunk to 1/3 of its people. Killed, shot, hanged, drowned, starved to death. Shooting those trying to escape was a profitable daily game for the guards. For each headshot, they were given 5 marks and 3 days special leave. Some managed several hits a day. There were also 2 jackals in human form among us who were our capos. They were the henchmen of death and enjoyed themselves, gleefully growing a fat stomach at the expense of the dying. Bread and death. Those were the 2 pillars of our existence. We had nothing else we could hold on to. Anything beyond that, and what we once called life was far, far away, and nothing but the smell of blood and decay, of torment and meanness, surrounded us here. And we dragged ourselves from one gray morning to the next under a crown of thorns with rattling bones, and never again did it get light. One morning, when I had reached a body weight of 86 pounds, a guard said, "Well, have you made up your mind yet? Do you want to cross over? I'm a perfect shot, and it doesn't hurt either, so come on. Just 1 step over the guard line, and you're saved."
Homosexuals as a group were not slated for total annihilation by the Nazis, like Jews and Roma and Sinti. The official view was that what needed eradicating was the homosexual lifestyle. By the Nazis' twisted logic, if the Aryan homosexual male could be made to give up his degenerate ways, there was still a place for him in the racially unified community of the German people. But in reality, the savagery of the Nazis' methods to cure or re-educate these men often proved lethal. Thousands of gay men died in the camps, usually during the first year of their incarceration. The so-called 175ers died as many other prisoners did, from forced labor, inadequate rations, disease, and injury, often as a result of torture, from suicide or the homicidal whims of the SS. But the SS often assigned them to even harder work details and gave them even less food, believing that it would toughen them up and make them more manly. It was the kind of conversion therapy that, for many, ended in death. Other efforts to stamp out homosexuality included forcing 175ers to have sex with female prisoners who'd been condemned to work the camp brothels. Danish doctor Carl Vernet claimed he could cure gay men by implanting an artificial gland under their skin that released testosterone. Under Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler's direction, a dozen prisoners at Buchenwald were subjected to the experiment. 2 died. We don't know the fates of the other 10. A more common attempt at curing men of their homosexuality involved coercing prisoners to submit to so-called voluntary sterilization or castration. Josef Kohout was a Viennese man who spent nearly 5.5 years in concentration camps because of his homosexuality. In a 1990 interview, he described how an SS officer in Flossenburg put pressure on him to get castrated.
Ein Sturmbannführer was.
He was a Sturmbannführer, and he called me in a few times, and it came up that homosexuals should be castrated. And I went in to see him, and he said to me, "Well, you gay pig, haven't you gotten yourself castrated yet?" I said, "No, and I'm not going to have it done either. I'll come out the same way I came in."
Once the Nazis standardized their prisoner classification system across concentration camps, most of the 175ers were forced to wear an inverted pink triangle badge on their camp uniform. The pink triangle may later have been reclaimed as a symbol of LGBTQ resistance and pride, but in the camps, it was a magnet for the scorn and hatred of the SS. In a system that was violent and dehumanizing for all inmates, there were special indignities reserved for prisoners with the pink triangle. In camps like Sachsenhausen, for example, pink triangle prisoners were isolated and subjected to inhumane scrutiny. Josef Kohout gave an account of this treatment in Heinz Heger's 1972 book, The Men with the Pink Triangle.
Our block was occupied only by homosexuals. We could only sleep in our nightshirts and had to keep our hands outside the blankets. "You queer assholes aren't going to start jerking off here." The windows had a centimeter of ice on them. Anyone found with his underclothes on in bed or his hands under his blanket, there were checks almost every night, was taken outside and had several bowls of water poured over him before being left standing outside for a good hour. Only a few people survived this treatment. The least result was bronchitis, and it was rare for any gay person taken into the sickbay to come out alive. We who wore the pink triangle were prioritized for medical experiments, and these generally ended in death. For my part, therefore, I took every care I could not to offend against the regulations.
SS officers also took pleasure in devising creative ways to degrade pink triangle prisoners. In the Auschwitz concentration camp, Jewish survivor Kitty Fischer witnessed the depths of humiliation gay men had to endure when, one day in 1944, she was caught in a humiliating situation herself.
A latrine is a long row of holes in the ground, one against the other. That's what latrines are. They were full of muck and shit and vomit, and I thought, I am not sitting in this dreck when my mother taught me you never sit on other people's toilet, and I crouched, and they caught me from the back with a stick, and I had a terrible pain and I fell into the latrine. So I was full of shit, no paper, no underwear, stark naked. And suddenly I saw a striped trousers walking towards me and big wooden clogs. And it was a man, and I looked for the Star of David, and he had a big pink triangle and a number, and he carried a bucket, and he carried a brush. And he said in a very beautiful German, not in Yiddish, "Hurry, hurry, get up, I have work to do." I said, "I can't. I am so ashamed. What is this?" And I looked at this pink triangle. And he said to me, "I'm gay. Ich bin schwul." But did I know what schwul was? I said, "Is that a religion?" He said, "No, I'm a homosexual." So I still didn't know. And he explained to me that with his partner, he lived in Munich, and the Gestapo under paragraph 175, which was for perversion, broke into the flat. The partner went to Dachau. He came to Auschwitz in 1940, 4 years before I met him. And a German, a non-Jew, and because he was not a Jew, they asked him sarcastically when they shaved him and put on the pyjama, "What is your profession?" He said, "I'm an academic portrait painter from Munich. We have just the right thing for you." And they took him to a laundry and gave him a bucket with whitewash and a brush. And since 1940, 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, he had to brush the shit of the latrine so that he shouldn't come out of experience with his brush. And that's what Germans did to Germans.
Pink Triangle prisoners weren't just scorned by the SS, but also by their fellow inmates, who upheld a blatant double standard when it came to same-sex behavior. As Josef Kohout noted, they reviled the 175ers as, quote, filthy queers, but they took a far more tolerant view of inmates from different prisoner groups who coerced more vulnerable men into sex. They were seen as straight men who engaged in homosexual behavior only because they didn't have access to women to satisfy their natural urges. Sexual coercion, and often violence, was rife in the camps. The SS created a hierarchy that put prisoners in charge of other prisoners in exchange for privileges, like better food and accommodations, and lighter work. Kapos, for example, supervised the labor details, block elders oversaw the barracks. Pink Triangle inmates almost never got these jobs. Most often, it was the Green Triangle prisoners, the criminals, who were elevated to the rank of capo or block elder. Many took advantage of their position of power to take a young lover, or a pipple, as they were often called. These prisoners, typically young teenagers, received privileges in turn: better rations, less strenuous work assignments, and protection. Gerald Rosenstein, a gay German Jew, was deported from the Netherlands with his family in 1940. They were taken to Auschwitz, where men and women were immediately separated from each other. He and his father were assigned to the men's barracks.
The capo and the sub-capo had a room at the beginning of the barracks, separated from the rest of the barracks, a private room with running water. And the capo had all of us lined up and went through the line, and he picked me out. He said, "I need somebody to clean the cabin for me." And whether he was gay or not, I don't know, but certainly no women being present, I was picked out as a sexual object for him. And I played completely dumb. I would not have played dumb if it hadn't been for peer pressure that my father was outside waiting for me, knowing what was going on, that all the other people we were with from Holland knew why I was picked out to go in there. And my smarts turned on. I could have easily been seduced by a sardine sandwich, which was offered to me, and chocolate, which was offered to me, and I said no. And then he pointed to a big jar of Vaseline standing there. That's, you know what that is for. And I said, ich weiß das nicht. So I don't know about that. Anyway, he got tired of my stupidity and my non-cooperation and sent me back outside, which was a very good thing, because if I had acquiesced and if he would have called tired of me, I would have just been sent to the gas chamber and he would have picked up another boy. As it is, he went outside and picked himself another boy who was perhaps more cooperative. And I was let off the hook. And believe me, it was an early experience in prison smarts, so to say. You know. Today there's an expression in the prison lingo, you know, I would have been his bitch, you know, but a bitch of a 40-year-old man, a 15-year-old or 16-year-old boy. And the social shame attached to it, even in Auschwitz, Birkenau, I could not overcome.
Few young men who caught the eye of a capo managed to extricate themselves the way that Rosenstein did. Many were recruited by force. But his predicament sums up the dangers and temptations of being a pipple. On the one hand, the promise of extra food when most people were starving. On the other, the dread and revulsion of being at the mercy of a criminal more than twice his age. And the fear of being ostracized by his fellow inmates. Because there was little sympathy in the camps for a pipple, or for any prisoner seen to benefit from sexual barter, even when their survival depended on it. Suspected lesbians who ended up in the concentration camps did not have their own identifying badge. There was no specific law that criminalized lesbian behavior, so they were grouped according to the primary reason for their arrest: racial, criminal, political, or social. Most often, they ended up being assigned the red triangle of political prisoners, or the black triangle of asocials. That was a catch-all category for Roma and Sinti, as well as nonconformists, alcoholics, vagrants, and other people the Nazis considered social deviants. But that didn't mean women's sexuality, or perceived sexuality, didn't affect their fate. In 1941, Dr. Friedrich Menneke, a eugenics proponent, was tasked with selecting victims for a euthanasia campaign designed to rid concentration camps of people who were unable to work, people the Nazis referred to as ballast. He was also authorized to select able-bodied Jews he considered undesirable for other reasons. Among the Jewish women Menneke singled out at the Ravensbrück concentration camp were Henny Sherman and Mary Punyer. Sherman, he noted, was a, quote, licentious lesbian. His summary of Punyer's case read, married, full Jewess, very active, saucy lesbian, constantly frequented lesbian bars and exchanged intimacies in the bar. In the spring of 1942, Sherman and Punyer were gassed by carbon monoxide. Homophobia in the camps didn't just extend to 175ers. In survivor testimonies recorded after the war, lesbians or women suspected of engaging in same-sex behavior are generally described with contempt, too, or with befuddled judgment, as in this clip from a Jewish camp survivor from Poland.
Because of the unusual circumstances, do you think that any of the women in your block had sexual relationships with each other? Or was that anything you saw?
I didn't saw. I saw lesbians. I heard lesbians doing it, and we didn't know what lesbian is. And I said, what are they doing there? So they said, don't you know? They'll make love. And I said, what love? I don't know, a woman with a woman. And they said, they're lesbians. So, because it was a lot of German lesbians too, you know. But they were Czechoslovakian, and they lived on top of me, and I hear them.
As far as this survivor was concerned, lesbian activity was something only women from other countries engaged in. The Germans and Czechoslovakians, not her fellow Poles. But in the camps, where people's physical and spiritual survival hung by a thread, queer experiences were more prevalent and meaningful than most survivor testimonies acknowledge. Arthur Hulot, a Belgian socialist resistance fighter who survived the Mauthausen and Dachau concentration camps, provided a rare, non-judgmental insight into this.
I didn't engage in homosexual activity, but I was on the verge. Yes, of course. Why? Because it's the most natural thing in the world. First of all, there are no women. Second, there's not only the physical need, that's not the only thing that comes into play, but the need for comfort, the need for friendship, the need for human warmth. Yes, of course. That brought me to the verge of homosexuality. We caught ourselves, my friend and I, laughing, and that's as far as it went. But I understood perfectly, going through it myself and coming so close. Well, I understood why for others it went much further. That's what you have to realize. The concentration camp, with a few exceptions, was a place where you were put for the rest of your days. There was no reason to think you'd ever get out alive.
Many inmates, regardless of their sexual orientation, sought relief from the everyday despair through affection or sexual intimacy with others. For Ovida de Ligt, it was her sense of self and her imagination that carried her through. De Ligt was a French resistance fighter assigned male at birth. She didn't start living her life as a woman until the early 1980s. But while she was incarcerated at the Neuengamme concentration camp as a political prisoner, it was her innate understanding of herself as a woman that served as a beacon. In her memoir, she wrote about retreating into a dream world to reanimate that pearl of femininity inside of her.
As for me, I'm convinced that what saved me is my feminine essence. After working for 14 or 15 hours, walking or running back and forth between the camp and the worksite, roll calls upon roll calls, endlessly waiting in fog or rain squall or snowstorm or under a scorching sun, after lining up for soup and 1,000 other hellish things, I'd come back to my block with my head done in from the yelling, my eyes full of sneering images, my body often black and blue. I was in a state of shock or severe agitation. I'd bury my head in my coarse, filthy sleeves and try to recover. It wasn't always easy, but I'd managed to seal my shell from breaths and drafts, noisy coughs and shouts, my neighbors' bony limbs and sharp elbows, murky smells, and above all, the whole hellish atmosphere of our day-to-day life. This way, I would give this pearl a new lease on life, a frail rebirth in which its little flame could sputter brighter than brighter. I would pull on skirts in wide expanses of freedom and fleetingness, in protective forests, meadows dotted with daisies and primroses, houses that were so very warm. I would be a hostess, an assistant, a fiancée, a little bride, a ballerina, a fashion model for stunning long dresses, a nurse, a mother, a schoolteacher, a poetess, a musician, a healer. I would dance in velvety muslin, elusive taffeta, layers of quivering gauze. I would swish against eddies of satin and caresses of tulle. I would be a caryatid of silk in motion. Nothing was too beautiful. And my reality wasn't snuffed out. It was kindled, in fact, by contradiction. I made a woman with my pain, with my soul, and I dreamed. I did more than dream. My pain and my soul, they were my real life. So I prevailed over the pervasive death, not only life being ended, but also being reduced to base instinct, stagnation, hopeless apathy. Femininity was not only an oasis, a wellspring, a rediscovery for me of depths. It was also my way up and out, beyond the watchtowers, into the blue and its stars. And it was a sheltered space that made the company of others feel possible again.
Most Pink Triangle prisoners in the camps were German men, or men who were considered German, like the Austrians whose homeland had been annexed by the Nazis in 1938. In general, no one else wore the pink triangle. After all, homosexuality was viewed primarily as a threat to the strength and growth of the German national community. That preoccupation was also reflected in the Nazis' policies toward homosexuals in countries they occupied during the war. In Poland, for example, gay men were at risk if they seduced German men, but sex among Polish men was not the Nazis' concern. As a 1942 Gestapo memorandum stated, quote, "It is not necessary to bring to court Poles who have sexual intercourse with Polish men. Rather, they must be evicted and transported to an area where their activities present no danger to Germandom." The Poles would never join the Germandom. Their Slavic blood was considered inferior, and once the war was won by the Nazis, Poland was to become a slave state. The Dutch, with their superior Nordic blood, were considered worthy of becoming an integral part of a future Greater Germany. And shortly after the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, they introduced a law modeled on paragraph 175. Tiemann Hoffmann was a teenager when he was arrested in a hotel with an older man in the occupied Netherlands in 1941.
En plotseling toen werd er hevig op de deur werd er gebonst. Dat bleek dus de hotelhouder te zijn en die zei: "Doe open of ik trap die deur."
Suddenly, there was a loud banging on the door. It turned out to be the hotel owner, and he said, "Open up, or I'll kick the door in." And that's what he did. The door immediately flew off its hinges, and there we were, with our clothes still in some disarray. The hotel owner said, "I see how it is. We got ourselves a couple of faggots here. I'm kicking you downstairs, and I'm turning you over to the police." He kept on ranting and raving, and that's how we were hustled down the stairs to the tap room. In the tap room, there was a table with about 8, 10, maybe 12 Germans, and the hotel owner said something in German that I didn't quite understand. The Germans stood up, took their rifles, attached bayonets to them, and just like that, we were surrounded. I couldn't move in any direction, and of course I was terrified. All I heard was that the hotel owner said, "They are Schwulen," faggots. Then, 2 police officers arrived, and one of them handcuffed me to him. He said, "If you try to draw attention outside or start a commotion or shout," he said, "look, this is a revolver." He showed the revolver, put it in his pocket, and kept pressing it up against my leg. He said, "I'll shoot you. I'm allowed to do that by the Germans because the Germans hate everything faggot. So it's your call. Either you come along quietly or I shoot you."
While Hoffmann was in custody, Dutch police officers beat him, tortured him, and confiscated his notebook. It contained the names of other gay men in his circle.
I think it was on the 3rd day after my arrest that they said I would have to identify my friends. And one of the police officers said, "Yeah, and 2 of those bastards you won't see again because one of them has already taken the coward's way out and hanged himself in his cell." That was Willy Bakker, a very nice guy. I think he was about 22, 23 years old, no more. And they said a hairdresser, a certain Leo, had gassed himself. They said it in a tone, laughing. They gloated over it. So I had to walk past my friends, acquaintances, and it was terrible, just terrible. They were lined up side by side, 6 or 7 men in a row, and there were no other civilians among them. It was just them lined up. They didn't have glass back then through which you could identify someone. You had to walk past them. And one by one, when the officer said, "Who's this?" I had to give their name. I walked past them, mostly with my head down, because I was ashamed. And I kept thinking, "I've betrayed you." Of course, that wasn't the case, but they were in that stupid notebook. That was the great misery. So I walked with my head down, and every once in a while I briefly raised my eyes. Then I saw who it was, and I said, "Yes, that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so." That confrontation, it was awful, just awful.
Hoffmann was 16 at the time. When he was temporarily released after that harrowing lineup, his mother picked him up at the police station. She gave him several beatings, and then she locked him in his room. When he was later ordered to appear in court, he went by himself. No one was there to support him. He was convicted and sent to prison for 7 months, then spent 2 years in reform schools before he was finally allowed to return home. Hoffmann was particularly unlucky. Few Dutch homosexuals were arrested. Enforcement of the Dutch anti-gay law was left to the local police and was generally lax. At the time of Hoffmann's 1941 arrest, the Nazis' priority lay elsewhere: the annihilation of Europe's Jews. By the time the war broke out in 1939, approximately 400,000 Jews had left Germany and Austria, whose annexation exposed Austrian Jews to the same anti-Semitic restrictions, harassment, and state-sanctioned violence that Jews in Germany experienced. Many immigrants found refuge in the U.S., Palestine, Great Britain, Central and South America, and Shanghai. But nearly 100,000 fled to other countries in Europe that were subsequently conquered by the Nazis. That's what happened to Austrian teenager Ruth Meyer, who witnessed the Nazis' takeover of her country.
Diary entry for Wednesday, October 5th, 1938. Vienna. It's early. Nobody on the streets. A Jewish man, young, well-dressed, comes round the corner. 2 SS men appear. Both of them hit the Jew. He staggers, holds up his head, moves on. I, Ruth Meyer, 18 years old, now pose the following question as a human being. As a human being, I ask the world whether it should be like this. I ask why it is allowed, why a German is permitted to hit a Jew for the simple reason that he is a German and the other man a Jew.
The writing was on the wall, and like many of their German neighbors, Austrian Jews who had the resources and connections to leave did. Meyer's mother, grandmother, and sister got visas for the UK, and in early 1939, Meyer herself made it to Norway. But in June 1940, Norway fell to Germany. As Meyer's hopes of being reunited with her family faded, she found comfort with Gunvor Hofmo, a woman she'd met in Norway's volunteer women's labor service, and she experienced their relationship with all the intensity of a great young love.
January 9th, 1941. The days are longer when you love somebody. When Gunvor is not there, something in me is missing. It is not until she reappears far away in my field of vision that I can let out a sigh of relief. She's back. September 22nd, 1941. Autumn has suddenly arrived as if overnight. Last week we were astonished as the trees were still green and the evenings still light. Now we're just as astonished because the leaves have turned totally yellow, as if overnight. The nights are now dark, and at nighttime I cannot see Gunvor when she lies beside me like a small child. In spring and summer, I saw her eyes watch me at night, so deep, so inscrutable, often so unutterably sad, too. Now I can only feel her mouth and her soft skin and hear her say, "It's so wonderful to have you lying beside me, so secure." November 22nd, 1941. Concerning loneliness. I'm no longer lonely. I have Gunvor. I've staked everything on her. And yet, sometimes I long for a man. Without Gunvor, I'd never be able to cope without a man. So this manlessness is just a gentle pain inside me.
In November 1942, Meyer was rounded up for deportation. she wrote a final note to Hoffmo that was smuggled out of the ship that would carry her to mainland Europe.
I think it's just as well that it happened this way. Why shouldn't we suffer when there's so much suffering? Don't worry about me. Perhaps I wouldn't even change places with you.
Meyer and 531 other Jews were sent to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Women, children, and those who couldn't work went directly to the gas chambers on arrival and were killed. Gunvor Hofmo went on to become a celebrated poet in her native Norway and lived openly as a lesbian in a long-term relationship. How Meyer herself would have identified or how she would have lived her life had she survived the war, we'll never know. But thanks to Hofmo, who saved Meyer's diary and letters, we do know how Meyer experienced her first true love during an all-too-short life. This is how we're left to piece together the experiences of LGBTQ people during the Nazi era, through all-too-rare written accounts, through traces of queer lives in Nazi archives, and through the few recorded testimonies from those who survived. In the 8 episodes to come, you'll hear from people who shared their recollections, often in the face of stigma and shame, and made an invaluable contribution to our understanding of the lives that LGBTQ people lived during this incredibly dark chapter of history. Up next, our first profile episode takes us to Poland, where 16-year-old Stefan Kaczynski falls in love with a Nazi soldier. This episode was produced by Inga Dataya, Nahani Rouse, and me, Eric Marcus. It was mixed and sound designed by Ann Pope. We had voiceovers by Arnie Burton, Claiborne Elder, John Cariani, Bianca Lee, and Rachel Botchin. Our studio engineers were Michael Bognar, Catherine Cook, and Charles de Montebello at CDM Sound Studios. Our music was composed by Fritz Myers. Thank you to our photo editor, Michael Green, our founding editor and producer, Sarah Birmingham, and our founding production partner, Jenna Weiss-Berman at Pineapple Street Studios. The segments of the Walter Schwarze and Kitty Fischer interviews are from the archive of the USC Shoah Foundation, the Institute for Visual History and Education. The oral history excerpts of Gerald Rosenstein, Rose Shevitz Warner, and Tiemann Hoffman are from the Jeff and Toby Hare Oral History Archive at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you to Queen, the Center for Queer History in Vienna, for the recording of the 1990 interview with Josef Kohout. The Arthur Olo excerpt was provided courtesy of the Fortnow Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University. Many thanks to Haymarket Books for their permission to excerpt Heinz Heger's The Men with the Pink Triangle. The excerpts from Ruth Meyer's diary, A Young Girl's Life Under Nazism, were included by permission of Gyldendal Norsk Forlag and the Random House Group Limited. Many thanks to Benoit Loiseau for providing us with research on Ovida Delect, to Éditions L'Harmattan for letting us use an excerpt from her memoir, La Vocation d'être femme, and to translator Jeffrey Zuckerman. Thank you also to Raymond Wolford at the Magnus Hirschfeld Society for providing us with a copy of Leo Klassen's wartime account in Humanitas, and to Agnes Krupp for her German translation help. To learn more about the people and stories featured in our episodes, please visit makinggayhistory.org, where you'll find links to additional information and archival photos, as well as full transcripts. This special series on the experiences of LGBTQ people during the rise of the Nazi regime, World War II, and the Holocaust is a production of Making Gay History in partnership with the Fortnow Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University. I'm Eric Marcus. Until next time.